Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. And we'll anxiously continue our reading and discussion of the great work by John Dowling entitled The History of Romanism, a book that proves beyond a shadow of doubt who the Antichrist is in the world. And we'll continue now with our discussion of the Council of Sardis. Okay, this is in the early 4th century of the so-called Christian Church, where the Bishop of Rome was appealed to decide a matter of controversy among bishops. And this is one example in history where a precedent was set that essentially named the papacy as the only one who is qualified or competent to decide matters of controversy between bishops, thereby making him supreme bishop, bishop of bishops. And it was a one-time situation, but the papacy was counted on to make a decision in a matter, and it set a precedent, according to papal tradition, that the Pope is the bishop of bishops, and the only one qualified to decide in matters of controversy among bishops, and to exercise, to make valid, to actually act upon this so-called precedent. The Pope of Rome, Zosimus at the time, was imposing himself upon the religious hierarchy of Africa, the bishops of Africa. And it says the African bishops, however, refused to acknowledge the authority of this papal decree, and after a protracted controversy, sent a final letter to the Bishop of Rome, quote, in which they assert the independence of their own and all other churches, and deny the pretended right of hearing appeals claimed by the Bishop of Rome, and further exhort him not to receive into communion persons who had been excommunicated from their own bishops, or to interfere in any way with the privileges of other churches, unquote. This is a matter of recorded history. Essentially, the African bishops did what every church bishop in the world should have done, and told the pretended pontiff in Rome to shove his pretended pontificate right up his papal posterior. Okay? Now, let me address my critics. Some of my listeners are no doubt going to be, well, somewhat offended by my choice of language this morning. Some might say, is this any kind of a way to hold a serious discussion about Christian affairs? I will answer you this much. Recall in the recorded history of the early Christian church, in the New Testament, where Jesus confronted the papal equivalent of his day, the religious hierarchy of Israel, and the language that he used. Whited sepulchres, spawn of Satan, sons of their father the devil. He condemned both them and their works. The only thing I can concede to my critics is that when discussing the modern day religious hierarchy of the Gentile church, that which calls itself Christianity, the only thing I will concede is I lack Christ's eloquence. But for anybody who has read Martin Luther or any of the other great Protestant writers of the past, when regarding and discussing the papacy, my language is mild in comparison. The language that I use is appropriate for the subject at hand, the papacy. And what greater epithet can one issue the papacy, then the man of sin, the son of perdition, the beast. He is indeed the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist. And I apologize to my listeners for not having Christ's eloquence. But that's as far as it goes. Anyone who has read Martin Luther's works and the language that he used in his discussion about the papacy will find my discussion complementary by comparison. So the bishops of Africa told the Pope to shove his papal supremacy right up his papal posterior. And that's what the whole world should do. Bishops, princes, kings, queens, potentates, the whole lot have failed to be legitimate representatives of Christ on the earth when they concede to the papal authority. Now there you have it. So now we'll continue with subsection 14. A second step toward the papal supremacy was a law enacted in the year 372 by the Emperor Valentinian, which favored extremely the rise and ambition of the bishops of Rome by empowering them, the bishops of Rome, to examine and judge other bishops. Okay, so we're having the same discussion. The papacy will not relent of his pretended right to interfere in the controversies of other bishops. He says, a few years afterward, the bishops assembled a council in Rome without considering the dangerous power they entrusted to one of their own members, and intent only upon the privilege it secured to them of exempting them from jurisdiction of the secular judges. Okay? So they make this concession to the Bishop of Rome for their own benefit, to set up their own hierarchical, let's call it ecclesiastical court system, so that they don't have to submit to the secular power. Okay? Rome has always asserted that she is higher than the secular power. All right? So here is another precedent, 372 AD, where Rome asserts to assemble her own councils to decide matters of controversy, essentially apart from any other jurisdiction. Okay, this is still in the effort, clawing and digging and scratching to achieve and maintain supremacy of the papacy. All right, it says, a few years afterward, the bishops assembled in council at Rome without considering the dangerous power they entrusted to one of their own numbers, and intent only upon the privilege it secured them of exemption from the jurisdiction of the secular judges, declared in the strongest terms their approbation of this law, and recommended that it should be immediately carried into effect in an address which they presented to the Emperor Gratian. Okay? So this is a papal power rally, and they're submitting notice to the Emperor that they're going to take care of matters themselves apart from the secular authorities. In other words, they have their own jurisdiction, and the civil power has no authority over them. All right. It says a third circumstance which contributed toward the rapidly increasing influence of the Roman bishops was the custom which obtained somewhat extensively before the close of the 4th century of referring to their decision in consequence of their claim to apostolic descent. You've heard of the apostolic succession of the Pope, that the Pope is the successor of the Apostle Peter, the rock and foundation of the church. Okay, this is how they justify separating or isolating the Bishop of Rome from any other legal jurisdiction. Okay, makes it autonomous. Again, he says, a third circumstance which contributed toward the rapid increasing influence of the Roman bishops was the custom, which obtained somewhat extensively before the close of the 4th century, of referring to their decision in consequence of their claim to apostolic descent all questions concerning the apostolic customs and doctrines. Okay? So they're trying to use the papal power on divine right, falling upon this cockamamie idea that somehow Christ made Peter the rock and foundation of the church, when in fact he did nothing of the sort. He simply declared himself to be the rock and foundation of the church, and Peter was a stone built upon that foundation. All right? There's no discussion in the Bible whatsoever of apostolic succession. All right? That's a creation of Rome. It's a phony justification for its self-styled unaccountability. It's self-styled autonomy. And it's self-styled divine right. No such thing. But still, for nearly 2,000 years, the papacy has maintained that it is the successor of the Apostle Peter, the rock and foundation of the church, and that it is the supreme, unaccountable, untouchable authority, as if it were Christ on earth, and no power on earth has any jurisdiction over it. All right, this gave them occasion to issue a vast number of didactic letters, generally called decretals, which soon assumed a tone of apostolic authority and were held in high estimation in the West as flowing from the apostolic tradition. Okay? So now the precedent is set that the Pope is the successor of Peter, and then therefore the vicar of Christ on earth. And in order to act upon this precedent, the papacy begins to issue decretals. And you've heard me read some of these decretals, these papal bulls, these papal decrees, and apostolic letters and such. Okay? They have no weight whatsoever in God's accounting. And man should have just as much regard for these papal decretals as Christ does. None. We should have nothing but disdain for any official document issued by the papacy, as though he has any authority whatsoever on the earth. All right, quote, "From this time forth, there was no controversy in the East in which each party did not seek to win the Bishop of Rome, and through him the Western Church, to its cause, vying with each other in flattery and servility." Okay? So once this precedent was established, papal supremacy, apostolic succession, and it was believed by people, then all of a sudden everybody focused their attention on gaining the support of the Bishop of Rome for any and every controversy. And the whole world flattered the Pope and served him in order to win his favor. This is how the papacy has grown to the state of corruption that it is today. It's all built on lies and fabrications, clearly denounced in the Scripture, foretold in the Scripture, and it is what it is. Anybody looking for a future fulfillment of an antichrist, a counterfeit Christ, has been deceived. Anybody looking to the future for this antichrist figure has been deceived. And I can say that with authority because I once was deceived and believed, as is taught in all the churches today, that the Antichrist of the man of sin, the son of perdition, is yet future. when in fact he has reigned and ruled and dominated and blasphemed God all throughout the Christian era. It's none other than the Papacy of Rome. Continuing now, it says, at the councils, his legates were always treated with the greatest deference, and at the Council of Chalcedon, they, for the first time, presided. So now the papacy has the power to call councils to order. All throughout history, up until this point, the papacy, the Bishop of Rome, if it participated at all, was simply an equal of other bishops at these councils. But for the first time, the papacy has clawed its way up to the point of presiding over its own council. All right. Now, the Council of Chalcedon was held in AD 451. So here we have the first example of a papal council all the way up to 451 AD. Now, look, the obvious question is, if there's any scriptural or divine prerogative of the Bishop of Rome, do you think it would take 451 years for it to ascend to power? Look, the papacy says Peter is the rock and foundation of the church, and that in a day, in a word, in a split second, Jesus made Peter the rock and foundation of the church. So why has it taken 451 years for this so-called successor of Peter to preside over its own council? It defies common sense. It defies history to say that the papacy is a divine institution. Now here we have the Council of Chalcedon held in AD 451, and notwithstanding the preeminence assumed therein by the legate of the Bishop of Rome, he had not power or influence to prevent the passage of a canon which proved extremely odious to his lordly master, Pope Leo, who has been surnamed Leo the Great, and which resulted in a protracted and bitter controversy between the bishops of Rome and the bishops of Constantinople, who should be the greatest. So the very first council over which the Bishop of Rome presided passed an ordinance or a canon or a law which brought into question who is the greatest, the Bishop of Constantinople or the Bishop of Rome? You got to know, you just got to know that God is sitting on his sovereign throne in heaven and looking down upon this great pretender on the earth and sees him clawing and digging his way to global supremacy. And just every now and then, God decides to throw a little hitch in his get-along, a little, throw a monkey wrench into the works. Just, if nothing else, for his own amusement, but primarily so that none of us could ever be deceived that this Bishop of Rome is anything but the scum of the earth, the Antichrist of the Bible. God sits on his throne and laughs at the pretensions of this sinful, wicked man of sin. He's a joke. And God at any time can throw a monkey wrench into his works. And he has repeatedly, and he still does today. And there's no reason in the world why any godly man or woman should be deceived and count the papacy as anything but what he is, a phony pretender, one who should never be paid any attention to in the world. Here at his very first council of 451, After 451 years of struggling to maintain some respect in the world, the Pope finally gets to call his own council, and it's brought into question. At that council, which bishop is the most supreme? The Bishop of Rome or the Bishop of Constantinople? You can just see God rocking back on his heels in laughter over this. Now, some years previous to this time, since the removal of the seat of the empire to Constantinople, the ambition and assumption of the bishops of Constantinople had almost equaled that of Rome. Okay? We had two antichrists in the world, right? Two bishops, one in Rome and one in Constantinople, fighting over the throne of the earth, essentially. Okay? Both people fighting over the rightful throne of Christ. Now, it said he had lately usurped the spiritual government of the provinces of Asia Minor, Thrace, Pontus, and the eastern part of Illyricum, very much to the chagrin and dissatisfaction of Leo. In other words, Constantinople was running all over the pretended supremacy of the Bishop of Rome. Excuse me. The Bishop of Constantinople, just as pretentious as the Bishop of Rome, decides that he's going to exalt his throne above the stars of God and sit upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. And so he starts to run all over territories claimed by the Pope of Rome. Okay? In other words, he's just stepping all over the Pope's toes here. And it says this dissatisfaction was increased when, by the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon, it was resolved that the same rights and honors which had been conferred upon the Bishop of Rome were also due to the Bishop of Constantinople on account of the equal dignity and luster of the two cities, that is, Constantinople and Rome. Look, they got their initial precedence because they were the bishops of the two largest and most beautiful cities of the empire, right? That's the only dignity they had. They just simply were the bishops of the two biggest and most powerful cities in town. So the people must consider them as bishop of bishops, right? So here you got God throwing monkey wrenches in, getting these two pretenders to fight one another, and this is for our observation. This is for our instruction. Okay? How can this be a divine right institution, whether it be seated in Constantinople or whether it be seated in Rome, if it's fighting over precedence? Okay? Is this any indication at all that God is establishing his authority on the earth through either the Bishop of Constantinople or the Bishop of Rome? The answer is clearly no. God has nothing to do with this but to make a mockery of it for our public amusement. All right? Do you comprehend what God's doing here? He's making a mockery of this by getting these two pretenders to fight over jurisdiction, to fight over fame and fortune and power and their lust for conquest. You'll find no division like this in the body of Christ, and this should be immediately obvious to all of us. God again is rocking back upon his heels in laughter over these two deluded institutions, one in Constantinople and one in Rome. He said this dissatisfaction was increased when, by the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon, it was resolved that the same rights and honors which had been conferred upon the Bishop of Rome were due to the Bishop of Constantinople on account of the equal dignity and luster of the two cities in which these prelates exercised their authority. Now, let me further demonstrate the great humor of God in this matter. We're talking about this challenge, this controversy between the self-styled Bishop of Constantinople and that of the so-called Bishop of Rome, fighting over supremacy. Now we have in the record, in the infallible record of the New Testament, two apostles, Peter and Paul. And by the way, both of these so-called bishops of Constantinople and Rome claim apostolic succession. And we have in the record in the New Testament the meeting of Paul and Peter, the two chief apostles. One was made an apostle because he visibly saw the resurrection of Christ and his ascension into heaven, and one who was smitten on a road to Damascus after his resurrection and made an apostle. And there were many challengers to Paul's apostleship. If you read his letters, you will see that in every one he defends his apostleship. His apostleship was always contested. But he met face to face with Peter, the other great apostle of Christ. And they each offered one another the right hand of fellowship. You didn't see any controversy between Peter and Paul. They were of the same spirit. They served the same Lord. They offered one another the right hand of fellowship. Now here we have the Antichrist in its embryonic stages. And first thing you know, there's a controversy, a challenge. This apostolic successor called the Bishop of Constantinople and this apostolic successor called the Bishop of Rome quarreling over jurisdiction and power and authority. One claiming supremacy over the other. Paul, who said that he would not build on another man's foundation, established his own churches. He worked independently for Christ. He didn't try to claim someone else's work for his own, someone else's jurisdiction for his own. He did what Christ instructed him to do. There was no controversy. But here we have two apostolic successors who are misbehaving, to say the least. This is the great humor of God. Are we to believe that these are successors of the apostles Peter and Paul, who offered one another the right hand of fellowship when these two successors are fighting like cats and dogs, clawing and digging and scratching to destroy one another so that the other can be supreme and autonomous? This is laughable. All right, this dissatisfaction was increased when by the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon, remember the Bishop of Rome was presiding over this one, it was resolved that the same rights and honors which had been conferred upon the Bishop of Rome were due to the Bishop of Constantinople on account of the equal dignity and luster of the two cities in which these prelates exercised their authority. The Pope's own council has betrayed him. You must know that that's how the Bishop of Rome sees this council. He has called this council to uphold his authority, and it openly acknowledges the Bishop of Constantinople as the Pope's equal. You must know that there was a smoke ascending from beneath the papal tiara at this point. All right? The same council confirmed also by a solemn act the Bishop of Constantinople in the spiritual government of those provinces over which he had ambitiously usurped jurisdiction. Remember, we named them earlier: Asia Minor, Thrace, Pontus, and the eastern part of Illyricum. These were ruled over by Pope Leo until Constantinople took them over. They stepped all over the Pope's jurisdiction. The Bishop of Constantinople exercised power and authority over lands previously claimed by the Bishop of Rome, Pope Leo. It says, Leo opposed with vehemence the passage of these decrees, and his opposition was seconded by that of several other prelates. But their efforts were vain, as the emperors threw in their weight into the balance and thus supported the decisions of the Grecian bishops. So this council, over which the papacy was the presider, literally gave up the store to the Bishop of Constantinople. God has just literally made a mockery of these two so-called apostolic successors, made a shamble of the Pope's pretended efforts to assert himself over all the churches and all the bishops and the whole world as it has now today. Did God make a mistake in this council? I mean, look at the position that the papacy holds in the world today. We see from the Global Vatican by Francis Rooney that the papacy controls not only the civil and foreign and domestic policy of the United States, it presides over the United Nations. But here in the early stages of this monstrosity, this Antichrist monstrosity, the Pope of Rome, in his own council, is struggling to maintain the jurisdictions that he claimed before the council. Can you see God now just reeling back on his heels in laughter of the shambles that he's made to both of these pretenders? And how obviously differing they are from the example set by the great apostles of the church, Paul and Peter? I see it. I hope my listeners see it. And they see it for what it is. It's a demonstration, an amusing demonstration of history. Now, continuing, it says, in consequence then of the decrees of this famous council, the Bishop of Constantinople began to contend obstinately for the supremacy with the Roman pontiff. Okay? This very council, called by the papacy, over which the papacy of Rome presided, gave deference to the Bishop of Constantinople, and the Bishop of Constantinople, following the example of the Bishop of Rome, acted upon this precedent and then obstinately began to challenge the Bishop of Rome for all of its pretended authority. You know, it just keeps getting funnier and funnier and funnier by the moment, doesn't it? It's a joke. It says, in consequence then of the decrees of this famous council, the Bishop of Constantinople began to contend obstinately for the supremacy with the Roman pontiff and to crush the patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch so as to make them feel the oppressive effects of his pretended superiority. Elated with the favor and proximity of the imperial court, he cast a haughty eye on all sides where any object were to be found on which he might exercise his ambition. After reducing under his jurisdiction these two patriarchs as prelates only of the second order, he invaded the diocese of the Roman pontiff and spoiled him of several provinces. The two former prelates, though they struggled with vehemence and raised considerable tumults by their opposition, yet they struggled ineffectually both for want of strength and likewise on account of a variety of unfavorable circumstances. But the Roman pontiff, far superior to them in wealth and power, contended also with more vigor and obstinacy, and in his turn gave a deadly wound to the usurped supremacy of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. So Rome finally wins out of this deal, but you can just see them fighting like cats and dogs. And look, how many lives were lost in the process? How many souls were condemned in the process? Acknowledging either one or both of these as anything having to do with Christ. Can you see the consequences? Now it says, notwithstanding the redoubled efforts of the latter, a variety of circumstances united in augmenting the power and authority of the Roman pontiff, though he had not, as yet, assumed the dignity of supreme lawgiver and judge of the whole Christian church. Okay? The author is telling you where all this is leading. Who is going to ultimately be the supreme lawgiver and the judge of the whole Christian church? Will it be the demon bishop from Constantinople or the demon bishop from Rome? That's all that's to be decided. He says, the bishops of Alexandria and Antioch, unable to make head against the lordly prelate of Constantinople, often fled to the Roman pontiff for succor against his violence. And the inferior order of bishops used the same method when their rights were invaded by the prelates of Alexandria and Antioch. You see, the whole institution of bishops, all the bishops of the so-called Christian church, began first to favor Constantinople when it was appropriate or beneficial to them, and then they favored the Bishop of Rome when it benefited them. You see the hypocrisy? It's a defining characteristic of this false church. Hypocrisy. And it's reduced all the bishops to little puppets on a string. First being controlled by the puppeteer in Constantinople, and then being controlled by the puppeteer in Rome. Whenever the tide of the war ebbed and flowed to different advantages, this made a mockery of the entire Christian church. And what would we expect Satan's minions to do? Okay? This is not Christ's church. You have not seen in the history of the true kingdom of Christ anything such as we've described in this book. The bishops of Alexandria and Antioch, unable to make headway against the lordly prelate of Constantinople, often fled to the Roman pontiff for succor, that is, comfort and support, against the bishop of Constantinople's violence. And the inferior order of bishops used the same method when their rights were invaded by the prelates of Alexandria and Antioch. So that the Bishop of Rome, by taking all these prelates alternately under his protection, daily added new decrees and influence and authority to the Roman see, rendering it everywhere respected, and was thus imperceptibly establishing its supremacy. This was, evidently, another of the steps by which he was rapidly ascending to the summit of ghostly dominion. So, out of this great controversy becomes the Vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God on earth, the supreme lawgiver and judge of every man, and no man may judge him. Kings must serve him as his vassals. The whole world must worship and obey the beast of Rome. This is real history. History that your futurist pastor dare not speak about. The answer is, this book needs to be read in every church that calls itself Christian. Now, this is subsection 15, still in chapter 1. The author says, one more circumstance is worthy of mention, as contributing in no small degree to the increase of the power and the influence of the Bishop of Rome, viz., the regard almost universally paid to him by the fierce and barbarous tribes who now in quick succession poured in from the north and conquered and ravaged Italy and the capital of the ancient empire. You know what this is? This is time for more Bible prophecy to be fulfilled. This is when the little horn of Daniel uproots 3 kings. These barbarous kingdoms, 3 in number, each successively rose up to challenge the papacy. And the papacy literally and figuratively uprooted them. It says in the years 408, 409, and 410, the proud city of Rome was 3 times in succession subjected to a siege by the renowned Alaric, king of the Goths, who is distinguished by contemporary historians by the terrible epithets of, quote, the scourge of God and, quote, the destroyer of nations, unquote. At first he was bought off by the terrified inhabitants, but at length the city, Rome, was taken and given up to be pillaged and sacked by the fierce Gothic soldiery. Okay? So here we have the Gothic hordes, pagan, barbarous, barbarians, who the papacy would regard as the scum of the earth, have now conquered Rome, the great eternal city, the city of the God of the earth, the papacy, is destroyed by brute beasts. You see God rocking back on his heels in laughter. After the Pope has usurped himself over the Bishop of Rome, or rather the Pope has usurped himself over the Bishop of Constantinople and won the battle for supremacy, now this great God upon the earth is being challenged by the scum of the earth. He wins victory over them too. It says in the year 452, the ferocious Attila, we know her as Attila, king of the Huns, invaded the north of Italy, laid waste to some of the fairest provinces, and was only prevented from marching to Rome and renewing the horrid cruelties and excesses of Alaric by an immense ransom and the powerful influence of the Roman pontiff, Leo the Great, as he is called, who at the head of the head of an embassy waited on Attila as he, quote, lay encamped in the place where the slow-winding Mencius is lost in the foaming waves of the lake Banicus, and trampled with his Scythian cavalry the farms of Catullus and Virgil, unquote. In the year 454, Rome was again taken and pillaged by Genseric, king of the Vandals. This is the second of the 3 kings. And in the year 476, the Western Empire was finally subverted, and Italy, with its renowned and time-honored capital, reduced under the dominion of the Gothic barbarians by the conquest of Odoacer, king of the Heruli, a tribe of the Goths, and the deposition and banishment of the Augustulus, if I can pronounce that correctly, Augustulus, the last of the Western Roman emperors. So the Pope's great supremacy has just turned to, well, I'd like to use another Iowan expression, but I won't. But the Pope's hair is all messed up at this point. The great God of gods, King of kings, and Lord of lords in Rome has just now 3 times been assaulted by the scum of the earth. And God laughs. This papacy wants to be the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and 3 times his throne has been challenged by the least of all the kings. Rome has been made a shambles and a laughingstock. Rome is embarrassed to tears. Somehow God's plan of making the Bishop of Rome has suffered loss after loss after loss. The only legitimate question at this point is God really behind the establishment of the papacy? Or has he simply put it on the earth to make a mockery of it? I think he put it on the earth to just make a mockery of it. History has made a mockery of the papacy, and it's God who orders history. The Bible foresaw the rise of this man of sin, the son of perdition. Now look at the status that the papacy enjoys in the world today. It has forgotten the mockery that God made of it in its early days. It pretends that none of this history has happened. It pretends that the Pope of Rome was an institution instituted by God himself, that the papacy in Christ's absence is to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that he's to be honored and obeyed and respected. And while early history proved that God just made an absolute mockery of it so that no one would be deceived by it. You see how important this history is to our understanding? You've got to ask yourself, why is not this history extant in all the churches? For our benefit, for the lesson that it teaches us, for the Bible prophecies that it has fulfilled. And yet, the Christian church, because this information is not discussed, it's not read, it's not reviewed, it's not taught, they look for a future Antichrist and a future fulfillment of the Bible prophecies that the papacy fulfilled long, long ago. It's called futurism. The truth is called historicism. We find the truth in history. We find the fulfillment of Bible prophecy in history. If you fail to observe that history, you fail to observe the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. When God prophesied, when Christ, through Paul, prophesied the rise of this man of sin, we should have expected it. When Paul said we should expect it. When the restrainer was taken out of the way. When the great falling away would take place, then that man of sin would be revealed. That's 2,000 years ago. He has clawed his way to global supremacy for 2,000 years. All the while, God has made a continual mockery of it. And the latest, greatest mockery is the revelation to the world that all the papal priests are pedophiles. And yet still the kings of the earth bend the knee in reverence and deference to the Pope of Rome. Unbelievable deception. Do not, my listeners, be deceived any longer.